He was the man you thought you knew, the quiet carpenter who showed up with a tool belt, a steady voice, and hands that seemed to remember how to fix anything. But for nearly 3 decades, while cameras watched him restore porches and plane old boards, he was doing something far quieter and far larger behind the scenes. Since 1999, he had been funneling money into rebuilding lives after disasters, helping families who lost everything. Not with speeches, not with press releases, with checks, hands-on work, and a foundation that stayed secret until a leak in 2025 pulled the curtain back. 3 families could have told the story sooner. They had been sworn to silence, and when the truth finally slipped out, it forced a lot of people to rethink what the man with the splintered palms had really been building all along. He was born on a cold January day in 1947 in a town whose houses still breathe the 18th century. The kind of place where the sound of a hammer was as common as the sound of a clock. Tom grew up with that sound stitched into the seams of his life. His father shaped stone for a living. His older brother learned the trade early. The house Tom remembers from childhood was less a living room and more a workshop with memories. Relatives doing the framing, hands in the plaster, tools stacked as if they were family heirlooms. By 8, he could mix mortar. By 10, he could swing a hammer with the certainty of someone who had been doing it from birth. He earned a scar on his left hand that never quite faded, a small, stubborn line that mapped the beginning of a life of labor. And then there was the family project no one forgets, a fallout shelter bored into the land beneath a 1787 colonial. For 2 years, Tom and Kin Doug framed and finished it by hand. It was backbreaking, methodical work, and when it finished, Tom felt something settle. The rhythm of building had slipped under his skin. It would keep him steady for decades. School offered a path out, but Tom chose another route. He had a scholarship he didn't take. He trusted the lessons that came from hands and weathered tools more than those that came from textbooks. In 1966, at 19, he and his brother launched a little outfit with a pickup truck and $500 worth of borrowed tools. It was a small beginning, attic remodels, a dozen jobs that first year found by word of mouth. Tom learned quickly that craftsmanship had its own currency, patience, honesty, and a finish that lasted. There were triumphs that read like the stuff of small-town lore. He milled a kitchen's custom oak cabinets through a blizzard and finished in 12 days for a price that felt like a fortune back then. He invented little solutions, reusing barnwood as a base for shingles to save clients money, and learned hard lessons when a roof collapsed underweight. That collapse changed him. Safety became a rule, not an option. He married Susan in 1972, and she quietly became the backbone of the business, turning a garage into an office and bookkeeping into a craft of its own. They weathered lawsuits by rebuilding what the law asked them to defend. When a client sued over a foundation, Tom mortgaged his house, spent nights on the site, rebuilding the structure hands-on, and turned a legal nightmare into a reputation that spread by word of the way a good job does. Then, one day, a producer showed up, not looking for drama, but for craft. A camera crew asked him to fix a sagging porch on the spot. Tom walked into the job and did what he always did, assessed, planned, and worked with a kind of calm focus that made strangers trust him. The repair took 2 hours. The rest was a matter of audiences discovering something they already felt watching him. A man who spoke plainly, who didn't dress up his craft with jargon, who whistled old folk tunes when sanding and preferred hand tools when a job demanded it. That preference cost him time, sometimes. On one project, his insistence on hand-nailing 500 boards slowed a shoot by a day. It annoyed some crew members. It won the respect of people who saw the result. The tension between speed and craft, between shortcuts that shaved hours and old methods that stood up to years, became central to his character. He favored the slow, the tested, the thing done right over the thing done fast. Danger shadowed that pace. A scaffold collapse in 1989 split a day and left Tom bearing the weight of a cameraman's life. He pushed a man out of the way, took the fall, and fractured his wrist. He wrapped the wrist, spint at it, and kept working. To the crew, it was proof of devotion. To the public, it was proof that his steadiness was not an act, but a part of him. His rise did not come with publicity stunts. It crept forward, one meticulous renovation after another. He'd spend months hunting for pegged ship timbers to replace a rotten beam, and then spend over 400 hours hand-cutting mortise and tenon joints until the work looked as if it belonged to another century. When restoration societies and writers began to notice, it wasn't because he sought them, it was because people could feel honesty in the work. One neglected house turned into a turning point. Craftsmen across the region began to borrow his standards. He had a knack for small innovations that mattered. During one old house overhaul, he invented a method of layered cedar wedges to level uneven floors, later called the shim method by those who copied it. It did what clever ideas do: solved a problem without pretending to be a revolution. Trade schools picked it up, and a new generation of carpenters learned to judge a floor by how it felt, not by how it looked on paper. The years stacked up with equal parts misadventure and quiet triumph. A handsaw blade that snapped in the middle of a live demo cut deep enough to cause a scene, but Tom wrapped the wound on camera, cracked a half-joke about tools having minds of their own, and in doing so turned a scary moment into a conversation about safety. Back surgeries and the long ache of a craftsman's body followed. He recovered faster than doctors expected, not because he didn't feel pain, but because he would rather work through a limit than let patients wither. His shop evolved too. He added a mill with machines tuned to an earlier age, even calibrating a 1920s planer until it produced flawless edge-glued panels. Those panels would end up in exhibits that showed a modern audience what hard, careful work could look like. He built a reputation that balanced tradition with a willingness to try sensible new things. Airtight seals for century-old window sashes that dramatically cut heating bills. Hidden dehumidification systems that saved warped floors from ruin. Recycled copper flashing, used for emergency gutters during storms. Each fix carried the same ethic: match the house, mind the details, annoy the easy shortcut. Tom's life was also family and mentorship. He argued with his nephew Charlie over whether to use prefabricated parts or carve corbels by hand. An argument that was never only about wood, but about what a trade should be. He taught apprentices on a schedule that felt almost monastic: patience, repetition, correction. Described by the people who trained with him, it was a workshop in ethics as much as in technique. Those who learned under him made fewer mistakes and cared more about the kind of finish that didn't scream for attention but stood up quietly for decades. He kept a private collection of tools, small, old, and lovingly restored. A distant hand saw bought for $50 at a barn auction became a treasure worth thousands. Planes and chisels told stories of others' hands. He sold restored pieces to fund scholarships. The workshop was less a museum than a place where tools came back to life, where history and practical use braided together. And then, threaded through all this public labor, he kept a private ledger of compassion. Starting in 1999, Tom used his resources, sometimes through anonymous donations, sometimes through a small family-run foundation, to help families hit by fire and flood in California and in his own backyard. He never took credit. He never posted it online. Those he helped were asked to keep the help quiet. 3 households, in particular, rebuilt with his funds and his crew's labor long before anyone outside the families knew. When a wildfire took all the roofs off a home on a hillside, a pickup truck arrived in the dead of night, and workers Tom trusted began the slow work of rebuilding before insurance checks and news cameras had time to appear. A family in Massachusetts, left with nothing after a sudden disaster, found their home rebuilt and their life rerouted by an unseen benefactor. The assistance was practical, materials, skilled labor, and targeted grants that prevented people from sliding into long-term housing instability. Why keep it secret? Tom never liked the idea of charity that was also an advertisement. He believed in dignity first, that rebuilding a house was one thing, but rebuilding pride, privacy, and a sense of normalcy without public spectacle was another. In his view, generosity was a tool, not a headline. When the story of those anonymous rebuilds leaked in 2025, it surprised fans and stung the people who thought they already knew everything about him. The secrecy did not diminish the help. If anything, it amplified the sense that some people do good precisely because they don't want applause. His influence stretched beyond individual rebuilds. His weekday demonstrations and weekend masterclasses sent ripples through the home repair world. He taught hand planing at expos, and when he hand planed a single piece of cherry for 48 hours straight, the sound of metal on wood became a kind of sermon. Tool stores reported spikes in sales of traditional equipment. Forums debated his methods online. People who had never swung a chisel watched and, in small ways, changed how they worked. Workshops he led mentored hundreds of carpenters. Data from those programs suggested fewer joinery mistakes and a steadier approach to structural decisions, all signs that a craft could be taught without losing its soul. By the mid-2010s, he had turned the day-to-day running of the company over to family. The business had grown. Employees, revenues, and the kinds of jobs that required paperwork as much as hands. Yet he did not retreat. He continued auditing job sites, stepping in to resolve errors no one else caught. Once, by simply walking through a nearly finished second story, he spotted a misaligned load-bearing wall. It would have been catastrophic if left. His intervention saved the homeowner a six-figure disaster and taught the crew that the work was never finished until a pair of practiced eyes had walked the site. A few years before the leak that revealed his quiet philanthropy, he found himself testing the limits of innovation. He examined 3D printed homes and pressed his hand into new joints, reminding younger builders that speed without strength was an illusion. The future might be faster, he mused, but what matters is whether the joints hold. His words didn't stop progress. They slowed it just enough for people to look and remember why the slow things sometimes last longer. Age and accident followed the familiar arc. A fall from a ladder in early 2025 fractured a hip. Doctors offered sober timelines. He ignored them. 6 weeks later, he was back working, teaching a ladder routine that traded bravado for small checkpoints and slow breathing between climbs. Older DIYers wrote to say that his honesty had kept them safe. Younger viewers took note of the way restraint could be a form of strength. There were honors, too. Organizations recognized a lifetime of quiet service and public education. He accepted them with the same low-key manner he had employed in everything else: a handshake, a short speech about the work itself, and then a return to the shop. He began a memoir in which he planned to tell the small stories, the nail that once caused a home inspection failure, the lesson it taught him about attention rather than grand design. He wanted to pass on a list of failures as much as a manual of successes.